Good evening, everyone, and good Friday. Thanks for joining us for another forum. Let me introduce our main event tonight. Laura Machete is a PCC doctoral student who started with us last fall. And I got to know Laura at Esalen and learned a little bit about her research. She's delving into the history of astrology, which, strangely enough, is not something that we talk too much about in PCC. We're very practice-oriented when it comes to astrology here. And I've appreciated in the few conversations I've had about your research, the way that you bring us more into the theory underlying it and the history as well. So Laura is a diligent scholar and the mother of two. And tonight she's going to share some of her ideas with us about the place of the human, or the anthropos, the macroanthropos, in the context of an enchanted cosmos. So please join me in welcoming Laura Machete.
Thank you. I am so glad this is intimate and I feel comfortable, and now we could just sort of talk, and it's just like I'm hanging out with all my friends, but I have everyone's undivided attention, which is sort of awesome. Yeah, Becca asked me if I would do a PCC forum talk a couple months ago, and she approached me and she asked, and my immediate answer was, of course, yes. And then after a couple minutes, I thought, well, what should I talk about? And Becca responds with the ever practical, well, whatever you're researching. And I just nodded, yeah, oh yeah, of course, I got it. And I just thought about it, and I was like, I'm not researching anything. I'm a graduate student. I don't have time for research. Like, that's a leisure activity. But I realized I actually probably am. There's always stuff going on. And if I'm not, I better get to it, because I am a doctoral student, and eventually this is leading somewhere. So I took this as an opportunity to sort of really recognize like what it is that I'm interested in and looking for out of my education, really. I'm still, last semester was my first semester here, and it's weird stepping into a program like this at PhD level, because I feel like there's a couple of years of material that I've missed, because a lot of people who go on to a PhD got their master's degree here, so they've really gotten a chance to feel out the community and understand nuances, like it is sort of practice-oriented when it comes to any type of astrology or archetypal cosmology, and just learning kind of like where I could possibly fit into that. And so the point of this talk and sort of like what I'm doing is really just kind of figuring out like where I fit in, and kind of creating a philosophical structure in which the way that I sort of envision the next couple of years of my life here, like what can kind of hold that. And so this is just a sort of early stage of setting like a fertile ground so that I can move forward. But also I think it's kind of a cool topic, so it's not just totally personal. So like Matt was saying, I am mostly a history of astrology. I fell in love with astrology, of course, as a sort of astrologer, and I did charts, and then the more that I started researching it and learning about its origins, the more fascinating it became, and the less and less I cared about whether someone was a Virgo or a Taurus, and really more about like what in the world was happening and how has this existed for so long and nobody's talking about it. And so that has been sort of a really huge part in defining my own personal philosophy. And within that system, within a sort of ancient astrological paradigm, they really did view the cosmos as a living sort of sentient creature, basically in line with Platonic cosmology. And one of the things that one of my old professors, Dimitra George, would say is that they viewed the cosmos, early astrologers viewed the cosmos as a living creature, and they viewed the human as like the expression on the face of that cosmic creature at the moment of birth. And so we're sort of like embodying this expression of the divine in our whole life and being. And I think that that's pretty cool, and that's sort of like, I don't know, the only thing that has really stuck with me in creating like a worldview, if I had to say that I had one. And really the ideas behind this are just that the cosmos is living, that it is sentient, and that it is overall beneficent. And I think that that's important, those three to kind of keep in mind. So in the description for my talk, I was suggesting that disenchantment is an aberration, and I really sort of stick with that. I think that if we look at the tradition of Hinduism, of Kabbalah, Platonic philosophy, alchemy, I mean, everything really did sort of look at the cosmos as interconnected, divine, living, breathing. And although, I wouldn't argue that disenchantment is not a real thing, I mean, clearly we see it all around us, the more that we sort of zoom out from our moment and time in history, the less prominent it seems. So that to me gives hope that we can kind of revert or move forward past this weird blip in our sort of consciousness. I think that there is the reality, though, and I also sort of hinted at this in my description of like the grave consequences of this sort of brief period where we seem to be totally disconnected from something that we seem to have been connected to for so long. And I think that, it's important that we sort of reestablish that relationship, perhaps with the hope of reestablishing a sense of respect. But we'll get to that. So I guess what I sort of wanted to do largely was just kind of like, I don't know, taking a trip down memory lane is kind of the way I think of it. My daughter's so adorable, the older one. Whenever she has friends over lately, especially like a new friend or someone who she's just becoming close to, she always pulls out the photo albums. It's like her favorite thing to do, and just like show her life. And I kind of see this as that, of just showing like, hey, no, look, we've had this really great relationship for so long, and look how beautiful it was. And to just sort of give that reminder, really, across the board. I also kind of can't help but fantasize, I guess, that like one day, a couple centuries from now, they'll look back and they'll be like, remember that time when people didn't think the cosmos was alive? Oh, how weird was that? Kind of like the way we think of people who thought the earth was flat, even though we know that really not many people thought the earth was flat. But I think that this will be something that we will sort of pass. So another sort of, I'm still just prefacing, I'm sorry, I just want to like level everything out and kind of bring us all to where my head is so that we can journey together. So another sort of way that I envisioned this is, like in Rick Tarnas's Passion of the Western Mind, he does this beautiful sort of correlation of I think it's pretty much his term, the problem of the planets, where he says that because basically of Plato's total intimate belief and intuition and commitment to an idea that the universe was divinely ordered and good and really perfect, that basically that sort of belief was passed down through generations and centuries of philosophers and astronomers and astrologers, leading up to 2,000 years later, basically the work of Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler that really gave us the most comprehensive understanding of the universe that we have so far. So we have a visionary philosopher / mythologist. I mean, Plato's work is so mythic as well, really setting the stage a couple thousand years earlier for a scientific revolution. And so I think that it's very much overlooked the power of vision and what a philosopher is capable of doing, even if we're not out there as physicists really sort of, taking instruments and measuring and trying to prove any of this stuff, just holding the belief in it, just holding the surety that we know that there is something sort of living, holding this all together, I think is enough and probably the best thing that we can do. And it's also sort of in line with program goals for PCC. And so I just wanted to kind of put this out there again. I think this is the third PCC program goal, and it is to draw from the deep wells of philosophical and religious wisdom together with other scholarly and scientific insights in order to bring forth a profound vision of a vibrant planetary era. And I think that, this is definitely like the calling, the place that I serve in all of this is to just continue, like just visions, just bringing about some way that we can see this and perceive it and make sense of it and then move forward from it. So now we can kind of go into all of the fun stuff. So the title was Microcosm, Macroanthropos, and the Quest for the World Soul. And I don't know how much of that I'm actually going to really get to, but some of it's here. So I just wanted to kind of point out the obvious. Microcosm is a little world, and the Macroanthropos is the giant man. Sometimes it's called the Macanthropos, and sometimes it's called Macroanthropos. But either way, it's the same sort of idea. And really, it's basically a giant human within which the whole cosmos is contained. Or a humanoid. Obviously, once you're at that level, you're not thinking of a human of flesh and bones, but you're sort of looking at it as an archetypal sort of anthropos. So obviously the sort of immediate question, or at least one that comes up for me, is why not macrocosm? I mean, we've heard for centuries, microcosm, macrocosm. This is a pretty common sort of dichotomy that we've sort of experienced in alchemy or poetry or philosophy for centuries. And these two don't always come together. And I think that the reason why I really wanted Macroanthropos with microcosm is because this gives them a sort of participation in each other, the world in us, but us in the world too. Rather than just a little world or a big world, like I really wanted the human to be a part of this. And there's this sort of reciprocating relationship between the two. And so I think that Macroanthropos is a really good word that I really don't see used very often. I found it in Thomas McEvilley's The Shape of Ancient Thought, and I mean, it really just was like there, and I was, this word is beautiful, and I've never really come across it, and it's hard to find a lot of people who look into this. It is there, but not as much as I think it could be. So I want to kind of, I don't know, make it come back or used more. So a couple of things that I wanted to sort of point out is that Macroanthropos is sort of, it's different from theos. I mean, we're not looking at like a giant god, basically, or God as a humanoid. This isn't God in his image like we would see with, say, Adam the creation. This is, you know, like the entire cosmos as a manifestation of a sort of humanoid representation. And I just wanted to point out the difference between this, which can often be sort of, some people will, I just want to make the distinguishment, I guess, between God and man in his image and like a macroanthropos, a humanoid that is somehow related to an entire picture of the cosmos and everything within and below and above and all around. So one sort of potential pitfall of this particular term, and I think that this is maybe why it's fallen out of favor, why it's not used entirely, is because there is this issue, I guess, with anthropomorphization. So basically there's, though, a distinction to be made between anthropomorphization and anthropocentrism. And I think that, you know, anthropomorphization, I just don't want to say that again. Anthropomorphizing has been often sort of considered a taboo. But most of the reasons why it seems taboo are totally anthropocentric. It's the idea is, you know, that in a scientific community you wouldn't want to look at an animal and say, oh, that animal's having feelings. So and if you look at an animal and think it has feelings, then you're anthropomorphizing it. And I think that that is so anthropocentric to assume that sentience or feeling can only exist within a human. It seems to me that that's just totally wrong, and it's also being proven every day more and more scientifically that animals do have feelings. And so I think that feelings and sentience are more like aspects of creation and not necessarily just human. So I think, so that's all. I just kind of wanted to point that out. And I think that there's also benefits to anthropomorphization, but we'll get into the pitfalls of these at the end. In that likeness, you know, if I'm human and I see something else or cosmos is human, kind of potentially invites sympathy or consideration, or perhaps even, and this is totally a stretch, compassion. But it also seems to be something that humans have been doing forever. Some of our oldest forms of art are anthropomorphic in nature or zoomorphic, depending on how you look at it. And also we couldn't really tell. An image like this of the Lion Man from Hohenstein-Stadel, which is 40,000 years old, we really don't know if that was a lion anthropomorphized to be a man, or a man zoomorphized to be a lion, or really what do those things mean now, or what did they mean 40,000 years ago? We have absolutely no idea. But I still think it's interesting. So this is a common thing that's been happening in humanity basically forever. And then there's also this image, which of course has been, I think, made famous by Joseph Campbell. But again, this is from about 13,000 BC from France. And then of course in any sort of indigenous culture, there's always a relationship to animals or to wearing the skins of animals and kind of crossing those boundaries between what's human, what's alive, what's life. I don't think that the distinctions were always so sharply drawn. Some people call that animism, some people call it in a sort of loose way enchantment, but I think it was just a natural reaction to being alive in a world of other living creatures. So I like to sort of pretend that maybe we need to create a new word instead of anthropomorphism, like cosmomorphism or something. That's another mouthful. Cosmic sympathy, which has been definitely used at different times in history. So now we're going to go into some slides, and I'm just going to kind of walk through, and I have some things to show. But again, this is just kind of, like I said, a trip down memory lane of different ways in which we have envisioned the cosmos. I also want to point out that there is a lot missing from this. I mean, you could do this forever, really. There's so many ways in which this has become manifest across the world, the idea of a macroanthropos. But we only have limited time and space, and I only have so much ability to do any of this, so I'm leaving a ton out, and I recognize that. So I'm kind of working on a timeline, but loosely. So Nut, of course, was the Egyptian goddess of the sky. She's sort of seen here over the boat. And you can't really tell from this particular image, the next one it's better, but she has, all of the stars sort of adorning her body, and she really did kind of represent the boundaries. And this is one of the very few examples of this of the Macroanthropos being a woman. And I think that that's interesting, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Next sort of image is basically of Purusha, and this is the Vedic sort of being that contains everything. In the Rig Veda, it is depicted as having 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet, and it envelops the earth from all sides. And this is one of the more common sort of manifestations of what I would call Macroanthropos. Anytime, if you do any research or try and look it up, most of the times you'll see Macroanthropos, it's associated with Purusha. So this is an important representation of that idea. This is just more of the same. I think that in the Upanishads, there's a quote that I wanted to read. It says, "As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the common mind. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. As is the atom, so is the universe." So these are really, really old texts. I mean, nobody really knows how old the Vedas are. Anywhere from 3 million years old to probably 5,000, if we wanted to look at hard evidence that, textual evidence. But of course, it was a living tradition that went on much further back than that. And so there was already this relationship to the universe as something that was living, but something that was also somehow anthropomorphic. Another image of Purusha. And this, I thought, is also a sort of interesting step that was taken in Vedic tradition. This is Vatsu, which is basically the Hindu or Vedic equivalent of feng shui, which is just somehow more popular in contemporary culture, where you would take the image of the Purusha and superimpose it over a grid from which you could design a house, you would do architecture, and each of the quadrants sort of has signification based on the particular part of the body that is represented. So it's not only just a sort of philosophical or abstract idea sort of projected onto the heavens. It can be brought into like daily life and used very practically speaking. Of course, this particular image is from, I think, 200, 250 CE, but it was a very good image of Gaia and Uranos, which obviously came hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, but I wanted to sort of use this one because it made the most sense. You can see Uranos in the corner holding the sphere of the zodiac, and Gaia on the earth, most likely with the 4 seasons as her children. So Uranos definitely was one of the sort of very early depictions of the sky or the outer cosmos as a human, and in this case, a man. So moving forward, we get to Plato, and we'll keep returning to him, of course. And in the Timaeus, he says, "In this wise and for these reasons were generated all those stars which turn themselves about as they travel through heaven, to the end that this universe might be as similar as possible to the perfect and intelligible living creature in respect of its imitation of the eternal nature thereof." So this is one of the early sort of philosophical representations. Of course, there are some that are earlier, and Plato did not just spring out of a bubble. He had his own sources of inspiration. But this is a very early sort of depiction of the cosmos and the universe as an actual living creature. And the Greek really does, this isn't just a translation error. Like it really does say living creature. He really did believe that and kind of allowed that tradition to carry on. And I think that's all I wanted to say about Plato for now. We'll talk more later. So continuing forward through time, more or less, this is Adam Kadmon, which is an image, the idea of the original man in Kabbalah. So there is a sort of relationship to something bigger than just God or man in God's image in the Hebraic or Judaic tradition. And it really falls in Kabbalah, which again sort of comes a little bit later, more in the Middle Ages, but there's a long history, and there's definitely more of a story behind that, but this is where it seemed to be very popular. And this particular, in Kabbalah, Adam Kadmon not only sort of represents a relationship to the entire cosmos, but he also holds all of the souls of all men within him. And I think that that's interesting, that somehow there's a correlation between the souls of all humanity and also the entire cosmos, that those two things could be related within one sort of central divine figure. And then this is just another image I thought was cool, but that's all I have for it. Adam Kadmon also is usually depicted as the Sephiroth, as sort of the manifestation of Ein Sof, who is the infinite. And again, we're just sort of reestablishing like a, three-dimensional practical manifestation of something that is also connected to the soul of the world, the cosmos, and all of humanity. Moving on to definitely still in the Middle Ages with alchemy. I don't know if you guys can see this at all because it's sort of a small image, but this is the Melothesic man. So Melothesia was basically astrological medicine in the Middle Ages, and it was a widely practiced. I mean, I would say that most people who were practicing medicine in the Middle Ages knew about astrology and were absolutely considering that in relationship to what they used for curing, when they were, like what medicines they used, what times they were allowed to practice medicine. Surgery wasn't really surgery at that point, but if there was bloodletting or anything like that, it was always considered in relation to the stars, and that was because there was a firm belief that each part of the body was really intimately connected to the cosmos. So here we kind of see that microcosm coming out a little bit more rather than the projection of us outward. Now it starts to sort of move inward. This is just another beautiful image. This one, you can see the zodiac signs are kind of aligned down the center, but they're also on the outside as well. Again, I just think it's really pretty. So then there's also this other aspect in alchemy, which again in the Middle Ages was so closely related to astrology, but this is sort of a call too, that there's so little scholarship being done. And there's a lot, but in comparison, there's probably 500 times more research being done on Shakespeare than on medieval alchemy. And there's a lot that's missing as a result, I think. There's a lot of eyes that could be turned to these things to make a clearer picture of it. But alchemy and astrology definitely related in the Middle Ages, but the true extent to which we don't really have a clear picture of, mostly because it happened nearly 1,000 years ago. And so it's hard to say exactly how it was being practiced. But basically, this image is of a man, an alchemist, creating or in the middle of the magnum opus, where he creates what is called the homunculus, and this is quite literally the little man. That's what it translates to, and it tends to occur through in the moment of the great work, where you have the conjunctio of the lunar feminine and the masculine solar, and then they sort of bring forth this little person. And there's a couple images of it. So here's the conjunctio and at the bottom, and then in the top of the beaker at the neck is the little homunculus being born. And here he is as a sort of king. So there's speculation as to whether or not alchemy was ever really a pursuit for the philosopher's stone or the elixir for immortality, or if it was the creation of a human. And this has really kind of given way to the homunculus being used as an image for psychology, because this is a way to think about creating our individual soul, or as James Hillman would say, it's a soul making. So that's interesting, and I did want to just read from Paracelsus what he says about the homunculus, because I just think it's awesome. So the sperm of a man may be putrefied by itself in a sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which it's easily observed. After this time it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent and without a body. If after this it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood, and be nourished for up to 40 weeks, and be kept in the even heat of a horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom, with all its members like another child which is born from a woman, but being much smaller. And again, that doesn't entirely have much to do with macrocosm or microcosm or macroanthropos, but I just thought it was sort of awesome to think that just alchemy is such a beautiful tradition, and it definitely deals with all of these topics, and certainly really upheld a belief in a sentient cosmos, and a sort of natural living thing that was tangible that we could kind of relate to in plants and stones and each other. So that's all. And then I just kind of wanted to point out that I'm totally leaving out like a whole half of the globe, really more than a half of the globe. I'm not even really looking at Native American, and again, that's just because perhaps I might have had time, but I just didn't have the mental space to carry all of that. But this is an image of Mother Earth on the right and Father Sky on the left, and I love that they're these mirror images of each other, and you can see all the stars in Father Sky. So I just wanted to kind of put that up there to say I'm not unaware that this has existed all over, but that's as much as we could do. And then also, this was is this the diamond mandala?
This is I'm pretty sure it's a diamond mandala.
Shingon. Mm-hmm. So again, and then this is the Far East, which I didn't even touch on. So that was sort of a quick little depiction of the microcosm, macroanthropos, and where they've come from and where they've been. But I haven't really talked about the anima mundi yet, so I wanted to kind of briefly, oh, wait, we have all of now too. I wanted to discuss now images of Gaia. Really is, I think, how we have the closest relationship to macroanthropos at this point is through images of Gaia. This is, of course, Alex Gray. I thought this was just a beautiful image I found on the internet. And then this is one of my, I'm sure everybody has seen this, but I had this poster in my room as a teenager and stared at it incessantly for years. And I think it's a really important image. I like to see that the earth is really alive because it is covered in life. That should be enough, even though I think there's more to it. I really think that should be enough. Okay, so now we're kind of moving into the anima mundi, or the world soul. So earlier in the Timaeus, then the quote that I had read earlier, Plato says this, Socrates, or Timaeus says this to Socrates. Thus then, in accordance with the likely account, we must declare that this cosmos has verily come into existence as a living creature endowed with soul and reason, owing to the providence of God. So this is a pretty critical way of sort of seeing the universe as having really kind of come into existence with a soul, endowed with a soul. And what this sort of leads me to question is, well, then what is a soul, really? And in Hindu and Vedic culture, they believe that all living beings have a soul. Animals, I can't remember if they believe plants do too, but I know that animals have souls, even down to insects, and then humans as well. A soul that transcends, that can be considered a jiva, or a soul seeking liberation. But in the Abrahamic religions, it's only humans that have an immortal soul that could, say, attain salvation. So one of the interesting characteristics of a soul is that it generally necessitates some sort of immortality or some sort of afterlife, something transcendent or beyond what we see. It's also kind of archetypal. If you look at the Charvaka in Hinduism, they're a particular darshana or philosophical system of Vedic culture that is really material. They don't believe in anything beyond this life, and they don't believe in a soul, because a soul, the whole point of it is that it's something you can't see, and it's something that isn't bound by time or space and incarnation the way that we think of it. So, and again, we see this all over the place. In Egyptian, the soul is judged. The soul has to be able to sort of go past the body in order to be judged by Osiris. In Greek culture, the soul absolutely is what sort of travels to the underworld, to Hades. In Christianity, the soul has to be there in order for it to receive salvation and move on to heaven or not. And in Hinduism, it is what would be sort of resolved or liberated or reunited with the ultimate sort of Purusha, or the universal soul. And so what I sort of can't help but wonder is, if we are to imagine that the world has a soul, that this anima mundi exists, then we must also have to comprehend that there's a before and an after of the world. Because why would it necessarily need to be there unless it was going to travel? And so then what does that look like? And I think in myth, we see it most sort of commonly as chaos. Chaos is what precedes, though it's not always talked about as where we're headed. But then there's always this idea of potentially an omega point, like we see in Teilhard, like we're headed to something. But I like to, I'm under the assumption that outside of a sort of teleological perspective like Teilhard would have, it's almost always a return to something. It's a return to a source that we came out of. And so then we're kind of back at this place where we're just this Ouroboros sort of constantly cycling, in and out of existence, and that there's this part of us, or this soul of the world even, that could go back and forth through incarnation and reality, and then outwards, through, and then return back into some sort of nothing. But again, this is something that we have to give ourselves the opportunity to envision. And just for a little comedic sort of relief, I wanted to show something. So I'm sorry, this is going to take a second. This is one of the, I think that this was also, in addition to that poster on my wall, I think this really did something to my brain the first time I saw it. So just be patient. Because, come on, if we're returning to something, this is like the Ouroboros and such a great sort of manifestation. But I swear I saw that when I was probably 14, and I just remember thinking, like, that makes so much sense to me, you know? So I just kind of wanted to share that. So that's more or less the presentation that I have, but I do have some questions that I really want to sort of present that I think are really good for starting dialogue. And so one of the questions is, what about loving kindness? So is the universe a model for loving kindness? Humans suffer, like that's something that we all experience. Every single person in this room has suffered really deeply at some point in their life, sometimes more, sometimes less. But that's a universal, for sure, human suffering. So do we end up having to perceive the cosmos as necessarily unconscious because we just can't conceive of something being conscious that would hurt us so much? Now, I would say that there's a couple of sort of caveats to this. One of them being that the majority of humans, if we look at religious sort of inclinations, are totally comfortable with having a God that inflicts suffering and pain on most people. So I don't necessarily think that's part of it, but it's definitely a valid question of to what extent have we just become so fed up with our own suffering that we have to see the world as something that is just happenstance, because otherwise we cannot make sense of it. And maybe the model of a God image or a cruel universe is just too much, and so we have to see it as void of intention in order to just get through our day. Now, there's also this other question too, like, does the reality of human suffering have anything to do with a sentient cosmos? Does consciousness necessarily imply power or will or intention? We are all sort of conscious beings. We have intellect, and yet we still suffer, and sometimes we cause other people to suffer, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we have the power to prevent it or the will to create it. And so there's this fine line of recognizing consciousness in the universe and then sort of just allowing that. But again, this is just a sort of discussion topic of like, well, where does kindness fit into this? If we're envisioning the cosmos as sentient consciousness, life, can we talk about that? So then this kind of leads to the next question of like, what is the relationship between consciousness and ethics? Is there one? Should there be one? I think in terms of like, well, what does enchantment provide for us? Are we, or an enchanted worldview, are we sort of seeking truth and knowledge of the universe? Like, do we really want to know, is it conscious or is it unconscious? Or is it, quantumly transient, or is it actually materially substantial? Is it chaotic? Is it good? Is it bad? Are we really looking for that information, or are we kind of seeking a solution to a problem? Like, in other words, if we see the cosmos as sentient, does that mean that we will treat it better? And I think that that's just very short-sighted, because I think humans are really mean to each other. I think that recognizing consciousness in another is not necessarily the answer, because we seem to treat fellow sentient beings with more disrespect than we do unconscious beings. I suppose you could look at like a mine as a sort of rock genocide, but it's just not quite the same as what happens between humans. And so, but then there is the potential that maybe we do exercise just the slightest bit of moral restraint with our other fellow humans, because they are conscious beings. And maybe there is something to this sort of perspective that if we see the cosmos as alive and embodied and ensouled, then perhaps we will treat it better. But again, that's a question. Is that fair to say? And what are the repercussions of that? And then the other thing I wanted to just sort of bring up is, well, what's gender got to do with it? Where does gender fit into this? We haven't really talked about, whether or not this sort of cosmos, this ensouled, living, breathing entity is recognized as having gender or not. We know that Theos, or God, has decidedly been male for a very long time. But to what extent does gender have, anything to do with this whole conversation? And I think that was all I have to say. So those are the questions that I sort of want to pose. And again, if someone doesn't want to talk about these, you don't have to. But I think that this would be a good starting point for a productive conversation about this particular topic of microcosm and macroanthropos and the world soul. So that's all. Let's talk now. Thanks. And I'll just leave those up there. Does anybody have anything?
I have to go, but
Thank you.
Unfortunately, because these are great questions. I would just, there's a lot of things I would say about all of them. The one that comes foremost is the relationship between consciousness and ethics. A lot of times, for me, I feel that, yeah, the question about the relationship between consciousness and ethics comes up for me a lot. Each news article that sort of says things are dire and says we're all going down in some major thing, guys. Anybody paying attention? And so if you're conscious of that and you're letting that into your consciousness, what are the ethical responsibilities and responses there? And how do we understand that in the context of even a lovingly kind consciousness, cosmos? Or, you know, how far are people from that sort of being embraced by all these kinds of different animated souls and bodies, and how much would that open up for us if we felt that way? Or does it come down to just sort of like individual choice in a big sea? Yeah.
I mean, I struggle with those all the time, and I tend to be one who shies away from decisions as much as possible, even philosophical decisions. I can't help but hold different ways that things can possibly be, you know? But I do think that there is something to be said for the potential that maybe we really haven't experienced a living and souled cosmos, at least in this incarnation of humanity, with technology, with the global network of, you know, the internet and the things that are provided to us, the way that we can communicate with each other. So it would be worth a shot, you know. I mean, it would be definitely worth a shot to really sort of promote this and to try and see what happens and to see if it makes any headway. But I can't help but fear that we would treat things just the same because so much of our response to how we treat other people or animals or the world is not so much about it, but about us and about our own wounding and what goes on inside of us and what has happened to us and what we need to survive, what we think we need to survive. So those two really just sit right there, you know, but I'm always for trying. Yeah.
I'm curious if we maybe were too hasty to correlate our bad treatment of other living beings on Earth with our recognition of their consciousness, because I find it is not a recognition of another being's consciousness that leads us to treat something bad. It's not enough to be in dialogue with another human being to recognize somebody's consciousness. It means also recognizing an internal experience within the other, which would lead to a form of empathy and a compassionate direction. So it is, I think we're not yet there, even in our interaction. It is mostly, I feel, unconscious, and partly that is a result for our unethical treatment of the world. In my mind, considering the universe as a living, breathing entity can only have positive effects, and I feel it in my own relationship, and I can feel it in the vast mythology that you pointed out today. There's a certain sense of enchantment that I feel just looking at those images, to see Earth like a womb with a little creature in there, and there's, you know, and the poster that you had that you looked at since age 14. So I don't really have a question, but I wanted to say that some of those things that seem like conscious relationships today are far from it in my mind.
No, that I totally agree with that, and I think it's a great point. And then it also sort of raises the question of, well, then what is consciousness? I mean, obviously, because can you have consciousness without having awareness? To what extent are they related? And to what extent is it important to kind of recognize the power and the responsibility that accompanies consciousness? Maybe we don't do that. And then, the sort of necessity to recognize the power and responsibility of other people's consciousness as well. But it does seem like, that was certainly meant to create conversation. I don't know that that's at all how I think, but it's definitely a fear that I have, because I don't necessarily see, I want to say this is the solution. If everybody just believes that the world isn't sold, then people will stop treating it so poorly, and then perhaps, we could see a better place in 50 to 100 years. But then there's always that nagging critic voice inside of me that says that's not necessarily true. But I think that there's something to strive for, and that is a true level of consciousness where you're, not just consciousness as opposed to, say, sleeping or dreaming consciousness, but like actual sort of intellectual awareness, which is a gift that we've been given that I think is often I don't know, is it underused? Maybe underused. I'll be generous. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your amazing presentation, and I really loved all the beautiful pictures you had.
Thanks.
Really brought it to life. Looking at your questions, the sort of one symbol that that was evoked for me was the idea of the syzygy, and this idea of female and male and lunar and solar, and I think Jung in Aeon compares it to the union of opposites with unconscious and consciousness, and it's in that union, in that sort of bringing to light what has formerly been kind of held in darkness. I think that's kind of the process of consciousness to a large extent, becoming aware of others, learning new perspectives, and realizing your place in that greater whole. And with love being a kind of method for that greater awareness, I just see that as a process for, if we're able to understand this macroanthropos or microcosm, really kind of realizing that what we're doing to each other is, in a large extent, what we're doing to ourselves, so that if we're wrecking watersheds, or if we're, hurting people in our families or friend groups, it's really, it's a symbiotic relationship. So we're really kind of tasked with understanding that responsibility, which then feeds into the ethics thing. So, I liked your presentation. I thought it was good.
I don't know that I have a response to that. It did kind of trigger a thought of like, I did sort of like the idea that if we zoom out, just like zoom out and recognize that we're part of a living entity, then perhaps we can see the other as ourselves a little bit more. And so maybe that's where this comes in, of full consciousness being not just consciousness of ourselves, but consciousness of a bigger picture in which we're part of something, and therefore if something else is a part of that same something, we're all kind of together. And so that is, theoretically, again, that would maybe compel someone to have a more ethical stance towards others or towards other living things. It's definitely possible. But yeah, I think sometimes zooming out, away from ourselves so much, may help bring conscious awareness of someone else's consciousness, which in turn puts us in the same boat, gives us a similar sort of, a place where we can be one, I guess.
And also,
kind of
just to
freaky,
zoom very much in, sort of reminded of what little I've read of Gregory Bateson and just the idea of consciousness. If I understand it correctly, sort of the circuit that we're all engaged with, that is where consciousness is, essentially.
Yeah. Sounds awesome.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about these questions and how often when I enter into discussions with more skeptical, materialistically minded folks about a re-enchanted cosmos and a world soul and panpsychism and any of that, their usual response is, oh, well, isn't that nice and cute? And like, yeah, the whole universe is alive. I bet that makes you feel so good and warm and held. And I'm like, well, actually, I think there's a darker, more frightening dimension to re-enchantment, in the sense that, if human beings aren't the only conscious agents in the universe, that means that we've got to learn to make room for all of these other agencies that have their own desires.
Right.
And we've been unconscious of those other agents for a few hundred years.
Right.
And I think it is really an affront to the kind of autonomous subjectivity that has been cultivated for several hundred years in the West. And it's quite the contrary to that sort of materialist assumption that enchanting the cosmos is just about making ourselves feel more connected to a beautiful universe. There's that too,
Right.
but there's also that sense of, the sublime in the philosophical sense of like being terrified and overwhelmed by the immensity of this larger consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of being inside of some larger superorganism is kind of frightening, because it really forces you to dissolve that sense of separate egoic existence that is the norm nowadays, and it makes you feel really uncomfortable, So there's a side to re-enchantment that I think we should talk more about, because I think it forces us to deal with the ecological crisis in a way that makes us recognize how many things that we've grown used to in terms of our own autonomy and freedom and everything, that actually we exist within inside of a larger life process, that if Gaia is sentient, it could be that Gaia embodies more of the terrible mother archetype than the warm, loving
Right.
mother, And so I've found that there's that misconception, maybe within our own community, but also among, more materialistically minded folks, that enchantment is just about, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. And that's not always the case. Maybe there are angels and fairies, but there are also demons and succubi and so on. So it's like you get the whole thing when you re-enchant the world, not just the good part.
Right. Well, that's important. And, I had slightly come across something that sort of leaned in that direction. Just, how nature has in some ways been humanity's biggest enemy. And so giving it a consciousness is a sort of dangerous, slippery slope. And yeah, I mean, it's such an important part. And I kept thinking, like, when you're saying that, of just like, of moving in with somebody, like in a relationship where you're like, I have my space, and you have to put your stuff in my space, and how hard it is to really kind of become that, like, acceptance of like, okay, you are also an autonomous conscious being who also needs your own things, and having to work with that, and how jarring that can be, and to picture that on like a global scale of, and also on a psychological scale of really sort of the immensity of like moving in with the cosmos, like what would that, I mean, that would be so much to worry about, like, but it's things that we would need to worry about if we wanted to have a healthy, engaged, long-term committed relationship with this place that we live in. And we are sort of sharing space. But we did just sort of come in and colonize consciousness, like, and I like that. I like the possible sort of dark side of it, because and that would also kind of answer a lot of these questions too, of just, like, there is darkness. There's darkness in humans, in me, in you, in anybody. And then if there's going to be consciousness in the world too, it would also necessarily have some sort of shadow side. And we can't even really begin. I mean, we could begin to envision it, but we don't really know what would happen. So, but I like that. That's good, because I definitely am one who tends to think of enchantment as a cure-all. And this was sort of me just really starting to kind of say, maybe it's not, in what ways would it be and in what ways wouldn't it be? So that's a really good point. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. That was great.
Thanks.
Yeah. So many questions. Here's one. So this is a bit of a paradox. I agree with you. It's fascinating to contemplate that in the history of our presence on the planet, the disenchanted moment is really a moment compared to what always has been. And yet it's in this moment, and in fact it's in the last moment of that moment, that for the first time in the whole story of our being on this planet, that apparently we are awakening to ourselves as, in some sense, bound with the planet. Now, just, of course, indigenous cultures, earth-based cultures always knew they're bound with their fellow creatures and the earth and the sky and so on, but it doesn't appear that they had a sense of the planet in the way that we do. Certainly not the planet with its whole cosmological history, with its what we understand in terms of its evolutionary biological complexity, et cetera, et cetera. So at this moment of extreme disenchantment and pending apocalypse, right, we're awakening to the planet, and in some sense the planet is awakening to herself or itself through us, which brings us to this, this wonderful, complex archetype that you're initiating us into with these images and the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm. So, what do you make of this paradox that it's in this, not only in but seemingly through this moment of disenchantment, that the possibility of an awakening is happening, versus in contrast to the long dream, the enchanted dream that preceded, and then the nightmarish sort of quasi awakening in the night terror of disenchantment, right? At the end of that, there's a kind of possibility of something else.
I don't know. I don't know enough. I mean, I would say that, in the beginning I mentioned how I feel like there's chunks that I'm missing having come into PCC at this point. And I feel like, although I've sort of intuited and, wrote poems about this stuff and had loose relationships to this idea of humanity as the planet becoming conscious, I haven't really explored it in any sort of real philosophical or academic depth. And that shouldn't necessarily mean anything, but it does to me. That's how I learn. That's how I dream and envision things. And so I feel like there's a tradition or lots of people who really are starting to kind of really imagine this and talk about it and say, no, this is a potential of what's happening. And I feel like I've missed out on that conversation. Like I'm kind of walking in towards the end and saying, well, yes, I agree, but I actually have no idea what you're talking about, and
I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
You in fact have been birthing it. I mean, with the picture of you as a teenager, looking at that image on your wall,
I know, right?
and thinking, "Oh my God, you are like a crucible of that consciousness."
Yeah.
So you may not have been doing it academically, but
Right,
without what
but
you've
it's
been
happening.
doing, the
Yeah.
rest would be meaningless.
Well, and then that also speaks to, something that, when Becca asked me what my research was, I was like, I write poems and stories. I don't have any research, but then there's also this whole other aspect of to what extent does things like fiction and story kind of move this along, or can it, or should it be a vehicle for that? So, I mean, to me, it makes sense, I guess. It makes perfect sense because, you know, if you think of like even just human development, which I guess you could look at as the development of consciousness, you kind of have to reach that point. I mean, it's the perinatal matrix, it's adolescence, and I have one of those right now, and you know, like she is just, I mean, she's just bumping up against it, and it's dark and it's hard, and at the same time, that is how she is becoming her, and you see it. It's amazing to watch, you know, and so it totally makes sense to me intuitively, but I don't know that I have much more to say than that. Yeah.
That's great, Laura. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Excellent presentation, and thank you for all the comments. Really excellent. So, I don't know. I have a few things to say, but I probably won't get to it all. The relationship between consciousness and ethics, and just following on some of the comments here, it seems like to me it is like this double-edged sword. Like, in some level, it's both empowering and enlightening as far as the astrological kind of awareness and opening to that dimension of how we're connected to the whole. And it's both empowering, but it's also, there's a deep responsibility, I think, that is imbued in the understanding of that relationship. You're kind of instantly given more power to navigate your life, right, but at the same time more responsibility to actually adhere to what seems to be a moral dimension to the universe, where the cosmos is actually seeming to care for every human being in a very particular way. Every moment of your life, it's like, you know, every decision that you make has consequences that you generally can see manifest in the Saturn kind of quarterly aspects if they're major decisions in your life. And so it seems as though the universe, in a moral way, is actually paying attention to every person in that way, in a way that, like, yes, it's scary, you know, there's this whole other dimension of beings that do have a certain sense of autonomy, but they're only in our lives, I believe, in order to help us move towards a more noble expression of them, or a more, you know, life-enhancing embodiment of that relationship. I don't think that ultimately the universe is doing it to try and get us to be evil or, you know, selfish or negative. I think ultimately it's trying to get us to be more, like Sean was saying, like we're awakening to this unity of wholeness that the planet actually is. Quantum physics displays that, and so that understanding of the unity of things, both in science but also in astrology, which, like, you know, we had to go through the Copernican revolution, like you mentioned, and then, but also the discovery of the 3 outer planets are crucial, and we only discovered Pluto less than 100 years ago. Yeah. So, like, this is the very beginning of what seems like, I think maybe this is addressing some of your question, Sean, is like what's the goal, and like why not the continuous stream, and why this differentiation and the deformation of consciousness in the modern period, that kind of thing. But it seems as though it's that we needed that to forge the sense of autonomy that is made possible from the subject-object differentiation of, like, we thought we were superior to nature, you know, because the Copernican revolution was something we figured out, and no one else or no other method had been able to see it. And so we have been seeing ourselves as superior to it, and then that forges a sense of autonomy that now has the potential to make this connection back to the cosmos that wasn't really possible before we differentiated and became autonomous. So, like, it seems as though there might actually be a telos that's moving humanity in to differentiate individually, but then to have their own personal connection back to a loving cosmos that I think is ultimately feminine, if we're going to address the last question. But
got them all.
Yeah.
I mean, two things came up, and I might have lost them both already. You were talking about consciousness. Oh, ethics. So I'm taking an EWP class, East-West Psychology class, with Carol Whitfield right now, and we're learning basically about, like, basic fundamental Vedic philosophy, Eastern philosophy. And one of the things we're learning about is karma, and just, you know, the doctrine of karma and how it's so wonderful. But one of the really key sort of beliefs in Hinduism is that it has to be sort of an action, and it has to be a conscious action. Like, accidentally doing something wrong does not sort of accumulate bad karma. Or doing something that you didn't know was wrong does not sort of help you accumulate bad karma. And I remember thinking, like, that's not really fair because, you know, like, I feel like I try to live a dharmic life, but like, you know, I'll go to Starbucks and I'll get a paper cup and I'll feel it in my head. I'll be like, what am I doing? This is ridiculous, you know, like, I'm a horrible person. And then there are people who do much worse things, like eat animals and whatever, and they don't know that it's bad, so they're not accumulating bad karma, but I am. And so I felt so offended by this concept, but it's just that idea of a greater responsibility. Like, with more awareness comes more responsibility, for sure. And so I just thought that was funny, but it's also fantastic. I mean, Hindu philosophy, Eastern philosophy is so rich, and it answers so many of these questions. Like, it's, you know, you think of something like this about awareness and responsibility, and, you know, they had it figured out thousands and thousands of years ago, and it's part of their founding canon. But then you can also kind of look at the culture and see that is not a culture free of suffering or free of evil. You know, it's all very much there. So then, to what extent, again, does consciousness, or does a mythos even, have any say in how one person treats another person or plant or animal or world? So that was the first thing that came up. And then the second thing that came up was sort of about, you were kind of talking about the subject-object split, and this is just kind of an offshoot of that. And it's one of the fears I've had. At some point in the last couple of years, I realized, or it dawned on me, that a lot of the place that we're in right now is like kind of like an alchemist's dream. And like, I tend to really, like, you know, venerate like alchemy and the High Middle Ages and Renaissance, but that's what they were doing. They were trying to control nature. I mean, that was the whole point. And in a laboratory, I mean, you would take pieces of nature and try and manipulate it, and it has this kind of weird, you know, it can be seen as a really sort of like dark mad scientist art. But I feel like there was something so much more rich going on, and it didn't quite have that connotation. And so I always get that fear, and I would love to kind of figure out, like, how did they hold it that it was a sort of assisting in nature to become its best, rather than, you know, kind of digging in, and how are we different from that? Because, you know, there are good things to technology, there are bad things to technology, and to what extent are we just like alchemists gone mad, you know, and like just really doing horrible things? Or to what extent did that concept really kind of create the world in which we're in? And that would just horrify me, because I look at it as such a noble thing, but again, to what extent is that just a projection, you know, a historical imagination or a fantasy? So those are just two responses. I don't know if it's feminine. That's my perspective on that one. I think it's beyond both. I think it's a spinning sphere person that was both.
One thing.
Yeah, but after you.
Okay, I'm going to try to make it quick. One thing that comes up for me is I'm curious about how much our narrative around our perspective on history changes our relationship to it. And if I look at, let's say, Teilhard de Chardin and his cosmological narrative, it seems so filled with purpose and filled with direction that I quite open-heartedly, willingly signed up for it. At the same time, sometimes when I look at human history and you know, sort of the epoch of disenchantment that Sean Kelly was pointing out, and then as according to him, the necessary response towards a deepened awareness of our planetary existence. And I want to challenge that a little bit. I don't know where the dream, as he put it, would have led if we didn't go into the phase of disenchantment. I'm not sure if it is a necessary step. I could have created a different kind of story that doesn't require a complete dissociation for me to become aware of the cosmos. There are endless other possibilities in my mind, and even more so in my heart. Yeah. One of the things I remember in statistics, learning about the gambler's fallacy. And that was an interesting thing just with dice, that if you have 6 different numbers, that there's 1 in 6 chance that each of the numbers will appear. But the thing is that if you roll the dice and you hit the 6 5 times in a row, you kind of have a feeling it's not going to happen again, because I've exhausted that possibility. But the truth is, the chance is the same every single time. It doesn't change. In spite of that, almost like paradoxically, a continuous narrative unfolds that each of the numbers does appear equally to the other. So therefore, if you have, let's say, 1 million 6s in a row, it should bring the other numbers up to balance it out again. So there's a narrative that I can create, and actually the numbers seem to point to it.
Right.
So I'm not clarifying it, I'm making it more complicated, maybe. One of my favorite things to do. But where am I going with this? Disenchantment. For example, okay, so we are in a planetary phase. We have the internet. We are aware of information that is traveling at the speed of light. Then we hear statistics from Brian Swim that 70% of Americans don't know that our sun is a star. So I'm like, well, maybe we're not in the planetary area. Maybe we are like in the caveman, whatever. It's like, so I'm not sure. There's a superficial, I think, acknowledgement and understanding as to where our consciousness is. But when I look deeper, I'm mostly still thinking we are in Plato's cave, looking at the shadows and, wondering what the heck is going on.
Yeah. No, we were playing dice today with our daughter Evelyn, and we were playing a game where if you roll the dice, then you're in a race with the stuffed animal, and you do the stuffed animal however many parts that you rolled the dice, and she got like 6 so many times in a row, and I just remember being like, you're just winning, and normally I don't care, I want her to win, but at the same time it was just like, what is this, how is this possible? So it was just funny, that was such a good, and then conversely, on the 3rd round of the game, she got 1 and 1 and 1, and she kept trying to roll the dice and cheat her way out of it, and it would just keep coming up 1, and we were just it was just so funny, because you see it, and then you do think it can't happen again, but regardless of that, I do think that narrative is huge. I mean, obviously, I went to Pacific, I studied comparative mythology, and that's all of it. It's just that it's just narrative. I mean, so much of what happens in here is this narration that we've heard through however many different sources, and it radically influences everything that we think of. And I think that although I agree with you that sure, anyone in this room could have come up with a better option for self-awareness than what we're going through right now, I think that it's a perfectly fine response to the reality of what we're going through, to make sense of it.
Absolutely.
So yes, I totally agree, and maybe that's what we should, maybe that's part of our vision, is to create those visions. How could we have done this more efficiently, How could this have not sucked as bad as it seems to suck right now, this whole self-awareness process? But at the same time, I don't know, maybe, I think there's something to be said for that. But again, I'm going to hold both of them because I like doing that.
I'm 100% on board on the responsiveness that you're pointing out.
Yeah.
And the better we respond, I think the better our chances are towards an evolution that makes sense. But I'm shying away from saying it is a necessity.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yes, I can look at all my traumatic experiences of my life and say, whoever I am today is a consequence of it. But I'm not sure if it's a necessity.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that presentation. That was great.
Yeah.
I really appreciated something you said earlier on regarding how maybe we look at other things and we try and put a human cast onto it. And I think it's so important to kind of try and step completely away from that, even when contemplating a question such as ethics, to say that what is fundamentally wrong with pain? Does pain serve a necessary purpose of informing that change is occurring, for example?
Yeah.
And we can see that happen within ourselves, right? If you touch something that's hot, there's a rapid change of temperature and that pains. And maybe there's something important to see there regarding the larger macroanthropos sort of a concept. I think, loving kindness, loving kindness is all about acceptance. Only when you accept something completely can you be loving, kind towards it. And I think that understanding that, okay, cosmos has consciousness, is some kind of a being, that's acceptance, right? And once we accept that part, and more people do, what comes next, I think, should not be seen in a human concept of what's right and wrong, and just maybe appreciated and respected for whatever it is. Who's to say that chopping down a forest is using nature the way it wasn't supposed to be used? Maybe that is the way energetically it was going to end up being used. Why are humans separate from nature? Why are we saying nature is so good, but what humans do is wrong and bad? Those are just some thoughts I had. And I think regarding gender, when I see gender, I see a division of prioritization. One being that of conservation, and the other one being of exertion. And it's not to say male or female, like different species have different divisions of that. But if I were to look at a cosmos, it would just be maybe an integration of both of those. And I couldn't really imagine it being just about conservation of resources or just about expending resources, but something in between them. And I love that one picture of that goddess of the skies, or whatever, the Egyptian one. That was really beautiful. I'm considering going to PCC for an MA, so this was my first exposure to this community, and it was a great one.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that all of those are totally valid points, and certainly things that I have thought about before. And it would be so interesting. I can't help but just keep getting short stories in my head. But what would it be like to live without pain? Like, what if there was a human who somehow was born and lived an entire life and never felt a moment of pain? Like, what would that do to the psyche? And I think that there's, so it is an important question of how do we, it's so easy to associate pain with negativity, or if something is bad, it's something to be avoided. And naturally we avoid it. I mean, we repel. If you touch something hot, your body instinctively repels from it. You don't tend to enjoy it. There is the exception. But I think that it's a definitely important dynamic to understand. There's this whole sphere of experience, and to what extent do we tend to favor a certain portion of it, and what are the consequences of that? But yeah, I think those are all good points, and I don't know that I have much else to say. I mean, I definitely do wonder about that. Sometimes I think do we just want to sort of save nature because, when I live in Marin and it's beautiful and I'll walk outside and I'm like, oh, the trees. But I wonder to what extent, what's going on there? Is it just a sort of moment of pleasure for me? Is it something that I find soothing and so I want to preserve it in that state because it comforts me? Or do I recognize it as something integral in itself that wants to flourish and wants to be and doesn't want to be cut down? Those are questions I definitely ask. And I don't know that I have an answer. I think I know how I feel, but I definitely always will have that sort of critical voice that comes up and wonders those things. So thank you. Yeah, and welcome.
You have no pain, you burn your skin off.
Yeah.
You'd probably be a very destructive individual.
Maybe.
Because you'd never get social feedback to stop doing something.
Yeah. Be a cool story.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you said yes when I asked you to speak. I just briefly wanted to touch on the last question on gender, and what came to mind when Chad said, I think it's feminine, which seems to be the predominant view within PCC and this kind of worldview. And on the one hand, I'm more along the lines of what you said, of it's kind of the cosmos must be beyond gender, but in a way, we're living in a patriarchal culture, and it seems that part of the healing process is being able to recognize a greater feminine in the cosmos, and it's almost like a participatory enactment in Jorge Ferrer's sense, that we need a feminine cosmos to hold the healing of a patriarchal culture. And maybe that's why that gender might be more appealing within this worldview. So, yeah, I just wanted to comment on that.
Everybody watched the Louis C.K. video that's been floating around on PCC chat, right?
Yeah.
So
What happened to our mom?
Somebody better check the trunk of God's car. Like,
for bleach and a shovel.
He did something wrong. No, I mean, and that's true. And it is, you know, I took a class on feminism, women's spirituality class, which was very feminist, which is a world that I have been largely on the periphery of. And I find that I hate, I think maybe it's a defense mechanism, maybe it's simply a generational thing, but I tend to really not identify with any sort of struggle as gender. Like any of my struggles in life, I don't look at as having been distinctly because I was female. And so I have a hard time, and I tend to really try and pull away from that, but I think that there's something really to be said for maybe we're moving beyond that, but we've got to take this step, and we really do need to sort of allow a Gaia or a female sort of power of the divine or holder to kind of to carry us through to that stage. And kind of in line with that, so I'm sorry, what was your name? Abir? So sort of in, I guess, a little bit of response to what you were saying, I often think, especially in this particular community where there's, you know, a lot of, not a lot, but there's the real discussion and presence of the grief of this moment, basically, of allowing yourself to feel the grief of what's happening to the planet, to other people, to animals, to life, basically. And that, I find that to be very hard. Again, it might be a defense mechanism because in face of grief, I've also had to just keep going. So I just, okay, what's next? But one thing that I do think of is like, if you look at like the birth process, it's terrifying. It's terrifying and it's ugly and it's brutal and it looks a lot like death. I mean, if you could picture death, like I don't think birth is very far off from what that looks like. And in some cases, some people die in their sleep. Nobody gives birth in their sleep. You know what I mean? Like I mean, it's brutal. It's sometimes way more brutal than death could be. And I think that, you know, sometimes it can be so terrifying, I think, to just sit with that and to just be like, no, something's just being born, actually. And this is what birth looks like. It sucks and it's hard and it takes forever. And, you know, all of those really sort of heavy things really do have this connotation of birth. And then, you know, birth pains are important. You don't want to not feel them. But, okay, that's not true. Most women do not want to feel them, as evidenced by rising epidural rates. But, you know, I think that for the most part, they serve a really important purpose. And so doing away with that or shying away from the realities of pain and suffering sometimes can be a really negative thing. And also just kind of unnatural because it is part of the whole process. I don't know where I was going with this. I had some sort of final remark. But so I think in terms of like what we sort of need is not necessarily grieving. You know, we're not grieving a death. We're like sustaining a birth, and in order to sustain a birth you have to trust, number one. That is the most important like key component, is just a trust in the process, and also just sort of support. Like I think of a midwife, and their role is really one of all they can do is just tell you there's another side. Like that's all the midwife really does. It just says, nope, been there, done that. There's another side. You'll get there. Just suffer. You know, like they don't really alleviate it. They just give you that recognition that, you know, there is that other sort of place that you're going to end up in. And sometimes I think of that as really important thing to sort of envision for this process as midwife. I mean, I hear things about, you know, earth hospice or, you know, like the impending, and that just to me is so. It seems so far from a trusting relationship to a sentient life process. So I think Earth midwife is a better image.
I love that. That was great. It really resonates with the Groffian perspective. And
Yeah.
I've often seen our ecological situation in that light or that lens, in the sense that it's the success of the growth of the fetus that triggers the contractions from the womb, and that's kind of what happened with the population of the planet and industrial, technology. It's like the success of the growth of the human being is actually what's triggering the ecological contractions, and I do see it as a birth. I guess the big difference is we don't have like a place to be expelled from. We can't actually destroy the womb. We have to figure out that the womb is contracting, and we have to make our own changes in the way we relate to it in order for everything to survive as we'd like for it to. But I also think I really agree with your philosophical perspective on it, and seeing it as a midwife and not fearing it, and that, and something that I've thought about for a while, and I've shared with a couple people, but not a lot, in the community, because it's, I don't know. But here's what I've been thinking. It's like, if you look at mass extinction and you look at global warming as like a process of the human experience, it's something that we did without consciousness. Like, we've only gradually now become aware of it, and we've been doing it for a couple hundred years as far as global warming, mass extinction for longer than that. And so those were things that the human being, the species, was supposed to do. If you look at the rest of nature performing functions that were supposed to happen, like plants creating oxygen for us to breathe or whatever, it's like we were meant to create global warming. As soon as we started to control fire, it's a 50 to 100 year half-life for carbon dioxide. So even if we stop burning everything now, or even 40 years ago when first, it's still happening. So it was inevitable process that we were going to face and deal with, and it seems like a natural part of being human. And so therefore, again, not to fear it. I guess the big difference is that we have awareness of the potential right and wrong of what we're doing. We're like any other species that might have maybe annihilated another species, didn't know it was doing it, which we didn't either until very recently. So
sometimes knowledge is power, and sometimes ignorance is bliss, but yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
I do.
I really liked what you said.
Thanks.
I was initially going to try to respond to Sean's question or response, but he's long gone. And there's been so many other points too. But I just wanted to sort of go with this idea of birth and it being violent and dangerous, and a lot of mothers died, and there's always a potential for stillborns, and a lot of complications that make life unable to continue, essentially. But what Sean had said was, we're at this point at kind of complex planetary awareness, and for the first time ever. And I was kind of going to try to question that or push back on that, and I think Richard actually sort of said a lot of what I wanted to, but it seems to me that throughout history, this has been kind of a almost eternal phenomenon, in the sense that there have been, pockets of people or groups or communities that are able to reflect on these issues, and they are completely at odds with the sort of larger society. And what we think of this new idea of a planetary civilization seems it could be the sort of newest cosmion, whereas before, in cosmological societies, for instance, where the pharaoh or the king or the emperor was considered the sort of mediator of the divine, or the point at which the divine entered into the world. I'm wondering if it's kind of a fallacy to think that this teleology or this purpose is now coming to fruition. I just heard a kind of a report on Obama, prolonging his decision on the Keystone XL, and they were analyzing it, and it was, well, he's putting it off until after the midterm elections because, 66 to 70% believe the Keystone XL pipeline should be built, and it's political. He's going to approve it, but he wants his base to turn out and doesn't want to screw any of that up. So I just think of, Plato and his work really responding to the kind of fragmentation and, all of these perceived threats and persecution of, intellectuals, and trying to work with the various traditions that he's inheriting in order to kind of make sense of everything in light of existential crisis. And so, we've created this myth for ourselves that we're at this point in time, and there's the kind of flurry of a movement of movements who are working and enacting or giving birth to this new civilization that's going to be an Earth community, etc. But I really, wonder if that's true, if it's maybe a delusion, if we're actually a very small contingent with no power, and we're, disparate pockets. And so anyway, that's sort of to say that we're, engaged in this exact same myth-making process that, we've been in since Plato challenged the polis, since, the prophets challenged, the ruling cultural status quo that sort of people made sense of at the time. And I know you mentioned you're a storyteller and you're making your own stories, so I wonder how you go about doing that, how you formulate your own ideas, if you are interested in doing something new, if you feel like anything new can be done, if you feel like how do you go about that process?
I think that there's always something new that can be done and that can happen. I think that a lot of, there is that concern that this is a whole lot of hullabaloo for nothing, maybe, sometimes I wonder about that, that perhaps, I guess, so one of the things, I'm going to stick with birth just because it's something that I've experienced, it's personal to me. I know a little bit about it, and I think it's a really good metaphor. And this is a totally personal story, but I remember when I was pregnant with my second daughter, they measured, I did the, what's it called, ultrasound, and this is when we found out it was a girl. And at the same time, they were like, "Oh, your placenta is thick." And I was like, what does that mean? And so I freak out. I remember just being devastated, and they're like, "Well, we'll just keep an eye on it." So then I'm Googling and all of these horrible things, and it's just doom, doom, doom. And I was and then everything was totally fine. It just happened to be that it hadn't spread out at that moment. Maybe I was a little earlier along than the doctor thought, so maybe it was right on. But now they have these crazy instruments that can really pinpoint every single change. And so now everything seems to be an aberration from what it should be, rather than a recognition of the various ways in which a placenta can be formed, And I think that really kind of applies to this is, if we look at, and I sadly haven't taken a class with Brian Swim, but supposedly I've heard this in the community that he says something about however long it's been in the history of the Earth, the cosmological history of the Earth, and the temperature has stayed largely regulatory despite all of these sort of external changes, and that there are these inner sort of, defense mechanisms that kind of protect the Earth that we really don't even know about or are only starting to begin to learn about. And I think that that's true. I wonder sometimes if that's true. Are we just so obsessively studying the temperature of this year and that year and this year and that year, and to what extent are we misinterpreting this or missing a whole other side of this picture, a whole other reality, because of this newfound wisdom that we have that really is only accessible through instrumentation and a sort of invasive spirit, I guess. So I understand, and I worry about that. But, there's also, again, like, it's going to be better if we know these things and do take care of it. So it's better to have awareness, but to just keep that awareness and to understand where it's coming from, what are the motivations behind it, how did we get it, and to just always sort of question those things. So that's just what came up in response to that. But as far as what we are doing, I do think that, there's what's the quote, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. That's a woman, I can't remember her name, but I think that's an important thing to carry, because even if we are this isolated pocket, we can still be really powerful, for sure. I mean, there's a small group of people who are controlling the world, so like, oh, and one thing I did want to say is you were saying that birth is dangerous, yes, but you can think that it did in fact happen 7.5 billion times, right, in the last 100 years, because that's how many people are on the planet. Like 7.5 billion times birth has happened. I mean, I think it's mostly safe, like 7.5 billion times someone has been born in like 100 years. That's amazing to sort of to ponder that. So yes, there's potential for danger, but there's also a pretty well-worn path forward. Yeah. So then 3.5 billion in the last 40 years. It's getting safer every day. No. Anybody else? We're nearing an end.
I'm not yet finished. Let's see, a couple of thoughts and then a practical question. I recently had, like 2 nights ago, my neighbors over. They're like a new family that moved in, Indian family, and it was really interesting because the father of the husband, he came from India and he's really into astrology, so we really hit it off from different angles, but there was a common spirit that was really beautiful, and the more we spoke, I had to admit that I am a Westerner, that there is a clear sense and pressure in my life to make something of this life, which has a distinct beginning and a distinct end. And he affirmed his own belief that there is no distinct beginning and nor is there a distinct end, but there is an eternal return. And I asked him, how do you know about this? And one of the things he showed was images. We went online and looked at some images of gods, and he's like, these are, you see they're different bodies, and I'm like, yeah, one has an elephant head and the other one does not, and he's like, they're the same God, but different incarnations. So even the gods go through that process of dying and rebirthing, and because the mythology was so imbued with that quality that it was easier for them to adopt it into their regular life. Right. And the same reason that makes me so pressured to do something with his life does mean nothing to him. It is about the eternal return that gives him the pressure to do something with his life. And I began to realize how crucial our mythologies are, and that we can draw strength and courage from both stories. Yeah. Now to my practical thing, which is probably a little disconnected, but before we leave this group, I would love to hear a brainstorm of people as to what reasons and what ways do you find you can argue for the universe being a living, sentient being. Because I end up at this question sometimes in dialogue with people, especially that are not familiar with this study, and I'm trying to make the argument for a living universe, and I think we could maybe bring our thoughts together as to what do we say in those moments when we are asked.
Okay, so 2 things. First, I just remember, and I don't just remember Plato, I'm very public, but I was recently researching it, so this came up. And towards the end of the Republic, Socrates says something. He says to Glaucon, like, "Don't you know that your soul is immortal?" And Glaucon responds with, no, I don't know that. Like, are you really prepared to assert that? Like, how do you just know this? And it's just like such a great exchange of like, well, duh. And no, I don't know that. Like, did I miss something? Like, because I don't have any evidence for this. Like, how do you know? You know? And it's just such a great sort of exchange. But I really like that idea of the eternal return. You get another chance, or another many chances, because you're going to need it. But practically speaking, I don't know. I mean, honestly, sometimes, at some point recently, this just sort of occurred to me. I remember I was walking down a road, and the sun was behind me, and my shadow was lit, you know, or was there. Your shadow doesn't get lit. I don't know what my shadow appeared in front of me, and I was walking, and I was watching my shadow, and my shadow has motion, right? And it moves with me and my hair. Even like little strands of my hair would sort of move. And I was walking by a line of cars. I was actually leaving the ferry in Larkspur. So I'm walking down the street, and there's parked cars, and there's my shadow moving, and then there's these cars, and they're just still, right? Like, cars are still. And I thought, like, God, that is such a simple, like, sign of life, is motion, like internal motion, right? And if you look at the cosmos, it is internally, it's moving, you know, I mean, the whole thing, that's all it is just one great movement. And so how could it not be alive? The only way it could not be alive is if something alive were motivating it, like a car, because cars only go into motion when somebody gets inside of it and tells it to move. So I think that motion is a really, I mean, that would be enough. Like, to me, that's it. It's like, it moves, doesn't it? How's it moving if it's not alive? Or if it's not moving because it's alive, then it's moving because of something that is alive moving it. And that's very Platonic, really. I mean, that's the whole point. The prime mover, the demiurge, just sets it all sort of in motion, and that motion kind of somehow represents a tangible life. So that would be the first response, I would say. But I'm sure there's so many more poetic ones. That one's very simple, you know? It cuts to the chase.
I'll throw it in. The first thing that came to mind for me was imagination, because the images that emerge in any person or being's imagination are far beyond what anyone can actually experience just through the senses. And where is that coming from, if not a greater consciousness, if not a greater living being?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, tapping into the source.
I think it's a real tricky question. It's very tricky and very prone to getting into a heated discussion with somebody. And my answer to that is, like, I think it really needs to be experiential. I think someone really needs to experience that for themselves through an intensive meditation practice. That's my answer to that.
You know it when you feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I saw this documentary on fractals, and they were talking about Kleiber's law, which apparently I think is aimed at expressing the metabolic rate of an organism. And it says that basically the volume or the mass of the individual will... Basically, energy will move through it in the most efficient way, so that the difference between a mouse and an elephant, for instance, that mouse being very little, elephant being very big, the elephant has a much needs more fractals, essentially, in the blood vessels in order to kind of get that energy circulating. And so I'm not a scientist, and my response is clearly demonstrating that. But you know, that same law can be applied to cities, in the sense that if you are able to see how energy flows through a city, through car routes and roads and stuff like that, it's actually very much in accordance with that same law. So that kind of demonstrates, I guess, the association that can be made between cities and living things. And then from there, I think that, that Simpsons clip really, if that didn't do it for you, I think that should, because, just like a river will kind of branch out and give rise to all of these ecosystems, out of which, there's a kind of community of life that interacts with each other and births new possibilities and biodiversity, etc. The same kind of process I'd like to think is, inherent in, stars in the galaxy and galaxies in larger and larger clusters. So I don't know if that's at all right, but, at least retelling hearsay. So that definitely has given me a lot to think about.
So I think that in a few decades, maybe longer, that scientists in the future will look back and wonder how we didn't figure out that we were just looking at the data we already have from the wrong perspective or using the wrong paradigm to interpret it. In the same way that, for 1,500 years, astronomers were working on Ptolemy's model, geocentric model, and just adding epicycle upon epicycle in order to keep that old paradigm working, when Copernicus realized that, if we just put the sun at the center, then it makes, it's a lot simpler. I think that we already have the data of the universe as a time developmental system, where there's a total continuity between the physical, the biological, the psychological, with this evolutionary account of the development of the universe. It's very obvious, I think, that there's a sort of, that the universe is a developing organism, and once we look at the data from that perspective, it makes a lot more sense than the sort of hodgepodge of different, theories that are being stapled together now by cosmologists who are just hell-bent on maintaining the old mechanistic picture of the universe. Somehow in this current mechanistic paradigm, it makes more sense to them to posit that there are infinitely many universes just popping into existence, rather than assuming that somehow, the universe that we do know has some sort of an inner drive or life, So I think it's more scientific at this point to look at the data and say, the universe seems to be a living creature.
I always have to beat the dead horse.
What'd you say?
I always have to beat the dead horse, but it's all I know. Presentation I gave. What's that?
Well, he's using the dead horse for that.
I really agree with what you were saying, Matt, and I think astrology is one empirically valid method of interpreting that the universe is alive and living and conscious and actually striving to have a relationship with us. It's like the more we kind of understand our transits and stuff, it actually becomes a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you have an experience and then you recognize the archetype coming through and then you say, okay, if it's a difficult experience, you're like, all right, what do I do to realign myself in a positive way with what's happening? And it literally becomes like a conversation that you're having with the creative intelligence of the universe. So I think the more and more that evolves and our understanding of it evolves and our participation in it, the more and more we'll actually move into an enchanted kind of perspective of nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I know. I think of my dog, and how he's 8.5 now, And like he knows English pretty well. Like, he's a dog and he's learned English, you know? I mean, this is fantastic. So if dogs can learn English, then we should be able to learn the language of the cosmos. Like it might take a really, really long time, but I think we could sort of figure it out. But there has to be something there, you know? Because it happens. Like he understands so much from just being around it, you know? And if we just sort of tune in and pay attention, there's the potential to learn this sort of language of patterns is really all it is.
Yeah, that's great. The last thing I wanted to say was a comment to Abir's. Like, I do think it's a participatory experience that you need to have that really can kind of change that relationship. And that is what happened to me. It was like a profound experience, an experiential understanding of that relationship kind of opening up. And yeah, the more and more it opens up to everyone to have that, you know, experience, then like, what is it, Groff that says like we're on a race of initiation and catastrophe? It's like, you know, those two poles is like catastrophe or initiation. It's also interesting, catastrophe and disaster are both like against the stars, like disaster.
Right, yeah.
Catastrophe. It's like when you don't align yourself with the stars, and that happens.
You said a race between disaster and initiation?
Initiation and catastrophe.
I like that. That's fantastic. I'm in. Let's race. Okay, it's 8:30, so I think we're done unless anybody has any demanding, burning. No? Okay. Awesome. Thank you.